Welcome everyone, and happy International Women's Day. Tonight's presentation is Ruskin Women, 3 Generations of Leadership in a Changing Community. I'm Jennifer with the Tampa Hillsborough County Public Library, and I am joined tonight by Charlie Nelson. Charlie is a docent with the Tampa Bay History Center, specializing in the history of South Hillsborough County. And he is also working with a librarian at the South Shore campus of Hillsborough Community College to create a digital collection on South County history. This program is presented as part of our celebration of Women's History Month. To learn more about additional events planned for this month and view recommended reading lists and library resources for learning more about women's history, you can visit our website, hcplc.org/Women's History Month, to go straight to our Women's History Month splash page. And then after this program, I'd like to give you a little book shout out. If you want to learn more about the contributions of women to Florida history, you can check out the book, They Dared to Dream, Florida Women Who Shaped History by Doris Weatherford. To find out how to check out this title, just visit hcplc.org/books. And the title is also available as an ebook from Overdrive and can be checked out using the Libby app. And now I am going to turn off my camera and microphone and hand things over to Charlie Nelson.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm pleased to be here with you tonight on International Women's Day, where we're going to talk about Ruskin women who contributed to the creation of our community. So I'm going to show my screen a bit here. You should be seeing it now. I'm going to turn myself off. So I think we're ready to go. For a couple years now, Ruskin Library has been telling the story of Ruskin's unique history. And in our new library exhibit, which will most likely be in place later this week, we're going to talk about the contribution made by women in Ruskin and their contributions in creating our community in 3 distinct areas or time periods. A favorite professor of mine in grad school taught me that I should always re-examine a topic that I know well through different perspectives. And we're going to do that tonight through the perspective of gender, in an effort to shed new and perhaps even expansive light on the story of our very unique community in South Hillsborough County. Now, honestly, it would be impossible for me to list all of the women who played a part in Ruskin's history. So I've selected a few as representative, and we'll talk about them this evening. Now, in its earliest period, Ruskin was a progressive, intentional community experiment in the progressive era, founded in 1908 to 1909. And it was characterized by liberal intellectual inquiry and cooperative communitarianism and favoring education for the masses. So it's within that milieu that we actually are going to talk about Ruskin women. So let's get started. The first of those women is Adeline Dickman Miller. Now, she's related to both of the founding Ruskin families, the Dickman family and the Miller family. She was married to George Miller. I consider her, and some will disagree with me, but I'll argue with them, that she was the mother of Ruskin, not so much in the organization or the governance of the community, but she exhibited a great deal of leadership in the areas of education, the intellectual life of Ruskin, and in the spiritual arena. We're going to talk about each of those tonight. There's a constancy of themes that informed Adeline's life, the first of which is she was a lifelong educator. After graduating from Aurora College in Missouri, she married George Miller, and they went to Oregon, where she and George were headed the Philomath College in Oregon. At Philomath, she taught German and headed the women's programs in the university. In 1883, she took over for a short period of time as president of Philomath when her husband left to run for Congress. Now, Adeline was on the faculty of all 3 Ruskin colleges, and that might surprise you to know there were a couple colleges that preceded the Ruskin College here in Florida. She was a professor in Missouri and Illinois Ruskin colleges, as well as here in Florida. Here in Florida, she was vice president of Ruskin College and headed the women's programs. She taught literature and psychology as her two primary courses. She also had a lifelong devotion to national causes of temperance and voting, and was very interested in women's reforms issues as well. Back in Oregon again, she was the state temperance president and organizer of some of the earliest WCTU organizations in Oregon. She continued that work throughout her career in Missouri, Illinois, and here in Ruskin. And locally, she helped create an environment of social causes that helped to create a liberal social and cultural community here in Ruskin in its very early years. She was interested also in freeing women from household obligations. Now, in her mind, the more that she could free women from household organizations, the better that they could spend time on intellectual pursuits. While in Oregon, she actually designed and patented a dishwashing machine. And this is a copy of a patent that existed that she was granted by the United States Patent Office. I found a reference a little later on that this dishwashing machine was actually produced in Chicago when they moved back to that Illinois, and her husband was president of a small manufacturing company dedicated to its production. It didn't last long, and I couldn't find any records of sales histories, but it's remarkable that she did this patent without any education in mechanical engineering. As a teacher here in Ruskin, Florida, she taught literature. Ralph Waldo Emerson was a favorite of hers. She also taught psychology. She was very interested in the issues of transcendentalism and used Emerson to influence her teachings in transcendentalism and literature here in Ruskin. She was very interested in politics, although she didn't run for office here in Ruskin. She did once address the World Court on an issue, and was a frequent speaker sought out nationally and in Florida and locally on a wide variety of topics. She was primarily responsible for one lasting contribution to Ruskin history, and that was the creation of the President's Home. In Florida, she was reading John Ruskin's book on the poetry of architecture, and she noticed this line drawing that you'll see in the upper left-hand side of your screen of a Swiss chalet drawn by John Ruskin in 1837. When she moved to Florida in 1912, she and her husband needed a place to live, first full-time place to live, so she worked with a local architect and designed and built the President's Home that you'll see pictured in the lower right. You can see the similarities between the two homes. She insisted early on that it be wired for electricity. Even though electricity was not available in Ruskin, she was foresighted enough to know that eventually electricity would be brought to Ruskin, so this home was included. It served as the President's Home for the college and also a dormitory for a few women that went to the college, and also served as a classroom for some college classes. We'll talk a little more about this building in a little bit, and it's one of two Ruskin College buildings that still remain here in Ruskin. The rest burned, unfortunately, to the ground in 1918. Early Ruskin was also characterized by free intellectual inquiry, and Adeline had a large hand to play into that, specifically into religious matters. Ruskin was likely too small to support any one denomination, so the leaders encouraged extensive free spiritual inquiry into a wide variety of issues. And spiritualism was part of that environment. It was a well-accepted concept in Ruskin at the time. They actually at one point planned a spiritualist temple to be built in downtown Ruskin. Adeline was the leader in that specific inquiry of spiritualism. Interestingly, in that President's Home that we just saw a picture of, on the third floor, there was a small room that she called the Silence Room. And every Sunday afternoon, she and her husband, George, would go into that room and use a planchet. And this is a picture of some early planchets. Today, we would call these Ouija boards, where she and George communed with spirits like John Ruskin, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and even Greek philosophers to gain their insights on the issue of the day. Adeline, in a few years later, became a leader in the New Thought movement, which gained a foothold in Ruskin in the 1920s and 30s. Basically, New Thought is a belief that humans can share in God's creative power through thought alone. That religious inquiry had elements of spiritualism, transcendentalism, a bit of Christian Science, and other things, but all fit with Adeline's nature. So in looking at the life of Adeline Miller, and we could talk a lot more about her, she was a powerful, defining presence in early Ruskin. Her devotion to progressive women's issues helped attract other like-minded women to come to Ruskin. The cause of voting rights, and we've established that she was very much into women's suffrage issues, and universal suffrage came natural, not only to Adeline, but to Ruskin women as well. It might surprise you to know that Ruskin women, actually the property owners who were who were women, voted in local elections as early as 1910, 20 years before women's suffrage became a national law. They could also hold office in Ruskin, and several of them did. Once suffrage was granted, Ruskin women continued to add their political voice to a wide variety of issues, up until modern times, as we'll see. In October of 1921, Adeline, along with other leading women of Ruskin, organized the first League of Women's Voters chapter in Hillsborough County, and she was elected its president. One of the women that was invited to come to Ruskin was Kate Richards O'Hare. And Kate may well have helped establish the belief that Ruskin was a socialist community. It's not a belief that I would share today, but it certainly had that moniker back in the earliest days. Now, Kate O'Hare was one of the nation's most well-known suffragists and socialist reformers. In 1916, she unsuccessfully sought the vice presidential nomination on the Eugene Debs socialist candidate for president ticket. She was invited by George Miller to teach at Ruskin College in 1916 and 1917, where she taught sex education. And she was a frequent speaker on socialist economic issues around the United States and was very well known. Now, in 1917, while in North Dakota, she gave a speech where she was arrested for sedition, reportedly for opposing America's entry into World War I. She was one of the first and earliest people to be convicted under the sedition law that was passed during World War I. She was sentenced to 5 years in jail in Missouri and actually served 1 year on that sentence. Her husband, Frank, and her 4 children lived in Ruskin during that period of time. There's a pretty famous volume of letters contained in a book called Dear Sweethearts, where she wrote a series of letters to her family in Ruskin, and they were an important catalog of socialist thought in general, and also on prison reform, a cause that she took up after she left prison, and is well studied as socialist thought even today. And pictured above on the bottom right, you'll see a picture of her 4 children that was taken right before she left for prison here in Ruskin. Another giant of early Ruskin history was a lady, Harriet Orcutt. She was a significant contributor in intellectual, political, and social issues, and provided a depth of intellectual inquiry into Ruskin. Nationally, she was well known as a journalist, a novelist, and a teacher. She advocated for women's and workers' rights, suffrage, social reform, and other issues. In Ruskin, she was one of the women that ran for and successfully was elected to community office here, and was also an important booster of Ruskin, inviting other people, of like-minded people, to come to Ruskin. At Ruskin College, both in Illinois and in Florida, she taught languages, German, reading, and music. Recently, Harriet has been kind of rediscovered as an important social author and is now studied in women's programs throughout the United States. Her most famous novel is called A Modern Love Story That Does Not End at the Altar, that she published in 1894. And yes, I've read it. It's not my cup of tea, but you can read it online. if you like, if you want to know a little more about Harriet Orcutt's thinking. She was a contributing journalist and correspondent in newspapers, particularly socialist newspapers around the country, where she often popularized progressive economic theory and also invited like-minded people to move to Ruskin and participate in the community. Now, religiously, she also was a leader in intellectual inquiry. She identified herself as a theosophist, which fit well into that Ruskin free inquiry milieu. Now, theosophy is kind of difficult to summarize, but it's basically a teaching about God based upon mystical insight. There's some occultism involved in it. There's some spiritual contact. It's very syncretic with other Eastern European religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. Basically, theosophists are seeking an ancient universal religion that they believe you can discover through inquiry into this element. She once wrote a short story called The Empire of the Invisibles, which is also available online if you'd like, where you can read a collection of dialogues from beyond the grave that better explain theosophist theory. Now, Harriet came to Ruskin in 1911, where she was very involved, as I said, and very much a booster of the community. She was elected secretary of the Ruskin colony in 1910 and a trustee in the Common Good Society, which was kind of the governing body and certainly the sales agent for a lot of the land sales that were occurring in Ruskin. Now, she was a true socialist in every sense of the word and was president of the local Wayland Club, which was the socialist club here in Ruskin. She was co-founder of the 20th Century Club, which later became known as the Ruskin's Women's Club, which was established in 1914. In 1922, she's well remembered for establishing the Ruskin Library when she donated almost 500 books to the total of 800 books that established that library in her home. And she served as a librarian for 4 years from 1922 in 1926. Now, she has kind of a sad ending. She died in 1932 in the Tampa's Old People's Home and is buried in a mass grave in Woodlawn Cemetery in Tampa. This is her gravestone where she, amongst 20 some odd other people, are listed in this mass grave and is almost forgotten as an important contributor outside of Ruskin today. Now, excuse me, I've mentioned the Ruskin Women's Club several times, and arguably, while there were 5 women's organizations that did exist in early Ruskin history, this was the most influential of the 5, and certainly is the one that continued and still exists today, and is very strong in Ruskin issues today. Originally, the Women's Club, or the 20th Century Club, met at the home of Harriet Orcutt. Later, they used the Chamber of Commerce building as their home, and in 1940, they bought the Ruskin College president's home and moved into as their center. Today, this building still exists. It's over on US 41, very near College Avenue, and is on the National Register of Historic Landmarks. In 1940, the Women's Club changed its name to the Ruskin's Women Club, where its purpose was admittedly social, but also economic. And they were very interested in the development of Ruskin as a town. They took their mission very seriously, and by design, one of their club rules eliminated what they called the trifling and diverting conversations that might distract them for business. So it was all business at the Ruskin Women's Club in its earliest days. Over the years, the Women's Club has been a major booster in the community. It would be impossible for me to list all the issues, but just a couple. They petitioned for the state for an orphanage in 1922, unsuccessfully, but they were very active in that area. They've always been involved in highway beautification, community growth issues. They helped to create the Ruskin Cemetery, and in 1966, they helped establish the Ruskin Library in its present location after housing the library for several years in this president's home building that you see on the right. The Women's Club has been an influential voice in Ruskin history since the beginning. Now, World War I was a turning point for Ruskin women. See if I can get back to that. There we go. Women and men left the college during World War I, and few ever returned. Sadly, in 1918, the college burned to the ground, and George Miller died, who was president, and the school closed forever. So Ruskin was kind of forced to reinvent itself less as an ideological community to a more practical community. It transformed into a farm-based community, and new leaders and new women stepped up to the plate to help define this new Ruskin, this second iteration of Ruskin. Now, Pauline Dickman Nacar-Glawler is one of those transformative leaders. In 1908, she arrived in Ruskin as a teenager. She worked in the cooperative store. That's a picture of the cooperative store there in the middle. She also attended Ruskin College, where she was a basketball player. This is the only picture we have of her in her basketball uniform. We thought that important to show you. And she, like many of the other women and men, left Ruskin in World War II. She went to Washington to serve in a government office, but was one of the few to return to Ruskin. In the early 1920s, she and her first husband, Alvin McHarg, prospered in accumulating land during the initial years of the Florida land boom. When that land boom busted, they were left with significant acres of unsellable land, and Alvin turned to farming. He died in 1943, and Pauline actually took over the running of the farm. She did this in new ways. She was one of the first to advertise for workers to come to the farm of any race. That was often an issue in early parts of Ruskin, where Blacks and Hispanics were not welcome to come in to work on the farms in the earliest days. As one of Ruskin's first women business owners, she was a founding member of the Ruskin Women's Club, and she was also president of the Ruskin Chamber of Commerce. In 1965, she was the first woman business owner to receive an annual award for women. She was instrumental in founding the Ruskin Library, and the community room at our library is named in her honor. She was also the charter member and a founding member of the Ruskin's Methodist Church in 1924, and later she actually founded the Ruskin Christian Science Church in Ruskin as well. So Pauline Dickman had her feet in the first community, but also was transformational leader in creating the second farm-based economy as well. So was Esther Crawley Dickman. Now, many see her just as Paul Dickman's wife, but she too was a transformative leader with her feet planted in both areas. Now, she was the daughter of a very active socialist Ruskin pioneer by the name of George Washington Crawley. She attended Ruskin College, where she took Spanish classes, civics, and expression. And like Pauline, she left Ruskin to go to Washington during the war. But she too returned and married Paul Dickman. Now, in many respects, her life parallels Pauline's. She was a co-owner with her husband of the Coffee Cup Restaurant, a Ruskin institution that lasted well into the latter parts of the century. She was also a president of Ruskin's Women's Club, and very engaged in the community life and developing institutions to help support this new farm-based economy. She was a member of Ruskin Chamber of Commerce and one of the earliest organizers of the famous Ruskin Tomato Festival that honored the new farm-based economy in an annual festival that lasted in the 30s, 40s, and into the 50s. She was a founding charter member and lifelong member of the Ruskin Methodist Church. Now, Pauline and Esther were from old Ruskin stock that helped create this new farm-based oriented community and saw it through its transition. No one in the town, after the college burned, after George Miller died in 1919, after all the students left and the college closed, no one was interested in reestablishing this old Ruskin experiment. Rather, they were looking forward to this new farm-based community that would become America's salad bowl. And new institutions would be required to support this new community. Frances Carruthers is one of those women who served in this new community. She's probably best known as an educator, but as with so many of the Ruskin women we're going to talk about, she did so much more. In 1926, she and her husband came to Ruskin and were actually hired by the Dickmans to run what was then known as the Last Chance Restaurant. The name was changed to the Coffee Cup. In fact, Frances reports that it actually was she and her husband that came up with the name of the Coffee Cup. I'm not sure if that's a true story, but that's one Frances told. At Ruskin Elementary, she taught more than 1,600 children in Ruskin throughout the decades. She kept a journal of every single student that came through her classes, and there's a little blue star beside every boy who participated in World War II. Now, most of her career was spent at Ruskin as a beloved principal and teacher. Now, the school board tried to transfer her to Brandon in 1933, and they did for a couple years, but the parents and students rebelled and threatened to strike if she wasn't returned to Ruskin itself, and they relented and sent her back. She was very active in building Ruskin as a community active, as well as being an educator. She served for 3 years as president of the Women's Club in 1954 to 1956. She was an officer in the Chamber of Commerce. She was very active in developing an anti-drug effort in Ruskin. She was the librarian for a period of time. And she was a member of the Family Counseling Center and the PTA, and one of the first women members of the Ruskin Fire Department Auxiliary. She was honored by the Chamber of Commerce for her contributions to community growth in 1973. Medical care in Ruskin was very slow in development. For years, the only doctor that existed anywhere around was in Wimauma. Joyce Ely helped establish Ruskin's first medical care institutions with a particular emphasis on women, and a particular emphasis on women, poorer women. She was born in Illinois, and in World War I, she was a field nurse for the British troops at Rouen, France. She returned to Florida and joined the American Red Cross, and was assigned in Perry, Florida, to a lumber company health nurse where she fought typhoid and malaria. She had an 11-county area, and she mentioned that she had her own car and she drove around that central Florida area, but she carried a gun in her trunk. She never had to use it, but it was there in case she needed it. She was the first licensed midwife in all of Florida and trained hundreds of other women in Florida to provide midwife services to poor women in Florida. She first came to Ruskin in 1929 as a state-assigned infant and maternal nurse working in an 11-county area headquartered in Ruskin. Her mother also lived here in Ruskin. In 1945, seeing a need for more medical care, she actually opened the only licensed medical practice in Ruskin. And she operated out of a waterless room in the Chamber of Commerce building. She said that she had to go several houses nearby to fill up buckets with water to bring it back to the medical clinic. She took her tools home at night and sterilized them and brought them back the next day. In her practice, she provided maternity and health care services to thousands of Ruskin women, particularly those from poor and immigrant families. Today, the Joyce Ely Medical Center is named in her honor. There are several women business owners in this second generation of Ruskin, and I picked one to represent them all, and that's Mabel Clapperud Simmons. She's probably best known as the First Lady of Florida Flowers. She moved here in 1949 in Ohio to manage her father's flower business, and she grew it into Florida's largest flower company, shipping gladiolas, that's a picture of gladiolas, plus other flowers all over the state of Florida and on the East Coast. She was inducted into the Florida Agriculture Hall of Fame through her development of new strains of gladiola seeds that allow these plants to sprout earlier, with ways to protect the flower from frost and disease during the shipping process and the growing process. She was very strong and very active into environmental protections, and is credited with developing controls on industrial plant emissions. She wasn't afraid to take the big boys to court either, and she did so and won some very important environmental regulations that protected not only farmers but the citizens of South Hillsborough County. After the death of her husband, she was a noted philanthropist in Hillsborough County and gave $1 million to USF in asthma research and was an active supporter for Joshua House. In fact, sadly, she died in a horrific traffic accident here in Ruskin at the age of 83 in 2000, on the day before she was to be honored at Joshua House for her contributions. In the 1980s and 90s, South Shore, and Ruskin in particular, was becoming something else yet again. We were discovered after in 1985, I-75 was created, was finished, and all of a sudden South County was discovered by Hillsborough County government, developers, and real estate. So we changed into something different, which is even changing even today. And new women were needed to step up to the plate, and there are hundreds of women that did so. I've chosen one, Sandy Council, to be representative of the type of woman that stood up in New Ruskin to help define what and who Ruskin was to be in this new generation of a community. Now, Sandy came to Ruskin in 1966, first as a teacher and later as a business owner and community activist. Now, Sandy's been described as a clear-headed and visionary leader, and was seen as a person that could bridge gaps between people by sharing the knowledge that she gained, and it was extensive, on Ruskin area economic issues and connecting people to solve those problems. She was very active in working on a variety of issues facing this new third iteration of Ruskin. A partial list is that she was member and multi-year officer of the Ruskin Chamber of Commerce. She focused on economic development as the primary issue of her work in that environment. She helped begin and became an officer in the Ruskin Community Development Foundation. She was responsible for returning the Tomato Festival to Ruskin, now named the Tomato and Heritage Festival. She donated land to bring small farmers together when markets started disappearing in the 1990s and beyond, to create a Ruskin's Farmers Market. So they had a place to come and meet the market on terms that were favorable to them. She was very much involved in environmental issues, serving on the Cockroach Bay Aquatic Preserve Management Board, where they were very interested in improving water quality and ecotourism. She was helpful and responsible for developing Camp Bayou into an important nature preserve using ELAP funds from Hillsborough County. She too was very engaged in the Ruskin's Women's Club and also the Rotary Club. She served on the South Shore Arts Council, where she helped create the Firehouse Cultural Center. Sandy Council was a wonderful representative of the new modern woman that is trying to create Ruskin. Finally, I'd like you to meet Kathleen de la Pena McCook. She was not only a community active for Ruskin, but an international influencer in library sciences. And in some regards, Kathleen brings us full circle back to the type of woman that existed in the first iteration of Ruskin, where intellectual pursuits in their own right were important, but they were important also to help the community develop. She's a reminder of progressive Ruskin. Now, Kathleen de la Pena McCook is a USF professor on library sciences and is an internationally known librarian, scholar, and activist. There are so many awards that are credited to her that I won't even attempt to mention them. Her work centers around providing access to information to everyone so that everyone can make informed decisions in areas such as social justice, human rights, the First Amendment. She's also done vital work in Ruskin since 1993 in local efforts to improve the lives of women and its less fortunate citizens. She's a co-founder of the Rural Social Services Partnership, an officer of South County Coalition on Community Concerns. She and her husband were very active in democratic politics, hosting candidate forums throughout South County. These representative women helped define Ruskin in each era. In our first colonial effort, a new Ruskin was developed where intellectual inquiry, cooperative communitarianism was central to its identity. In the second iteration, farming was the name of the game. When Ruskin transformed itself to America's salad bowl, women helped build new stable institutions for Ruskin to not only survive during this transition, but to thrive and to grow. In the modern era, when external forces finally noticed South Shore, women were helped us identify who we were to become and how our most vulnerable citizens were to be protected. The women we've met today each actively engaged in the creation, growth, and definition of Ruskin. Would Ruskin have been the Ruskin we know today without them? I think I can safely say no. Something would be here and it would be a dynamic community, but it wouldn't have been the Ruskin that we know today. Were these the only women in Ruskin to make a difference? Absolutely not. I've omitted many, and any errors of omission are mine and mine alone. But these Ruskin women were an integral part of Ruskin's unique history, and each contributed a bit differently, but contribute they did. So in the end, I think my professor was right. When we look at history through a different lens, like gender, the story becomes more complete, and I think even more interesting. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it back to Jennifer, and thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Charlie, for telling us all about these amazing women. As he said, this is going to be the question and answer session. If you do have a question you'd like to ask, you can submit it at this time. If you're on a computer, you can type it into the question section on the control panel. And if you're on your phone or a tablet, just click on the question mark icon and then you can enter your question there. And while we're waiting for the questions to come in, I'd like to go ahead and tell you about the display on Ruskin history that is kept at the Ruskin Branch Library, which is at 26 Dickman Drive Southeast in Ruskin, Florida. The display contains rotating exhibits about the history of Ruskin based on various historical themes, and will soon be featuring images and artifacts related to the women discussed in tonight's presentation. While we're waiting to see, Charlie, could you just tell us a little bit about how you discovered some of the women you talked about tonight and gathered your information?
Sure. We started working on this project before the pandemic, actually. This was designed to be put in place in March of 2020. So we started working on this in 2019. And the first place I always start when it comes to researching is with Mac Miller. Mac is a grandson of George Miller, and he is just an absolute fount of information. I also talked with Frances Hereford, who has been around Ruskin area, originally Waimama and then Ruskin for many years, to try to get some ideas of who we should highlight in this particular area. I use a lot of newspapers. I've read a lot of Tampa Bay area newspaper clippings on women in Ruskin. Talked to some of the women involved. For example, talked to Kathleen De La Pena McCook, an absolutely fascinating woman to talk to on her role here in Ruskin. She's the one, by the way, that said if you don't pick Sandy Council as being the primary mover and shaker of Ruskin in the late area, you're missing the boat. So she was very helpful as well. So that's primarily it.
So we have a couple questions coming in. One question, how long did Kate Richards O'Hare live in Ruskin?
Just about a year and a half, in total, a year and a half to 2 years. After she came back to Ruskin, she didn't stay long. She and her husband moved out of town. He was a very famous socialist newspaper editor that ran a pretty well-known socialist newspaper at the time, the Buzzsaw, was quite in demand as a writer. So they moved out of Ruskin. I did find an indication that she and Adeline didn't see eye to eye on issues all the time. So that may have had some part to play in her moving, but I needed a little more research in that to figure that out. but they didn't stay long, maybe a total of 2 years.
Another question, is Sandy Council still living? And this person also commented that they thoroughly enjoy the Firehouse Cultural Center.
Yeah, it's a treasure here. They're absolutely wonderful. And if you haven't listened to their new radio station when you're in Ruskin, the Phoenix, be sure to do that. It's a community newspaper. Sandy Council is still alive. She's a business owner and she owns a Redneck, I don't remember the exact name of it, Redneck Company. They make a lot of hot sauces and send them out nationally by by mail. She's very much still engaged in Ruskin and is an important part and a treasure in our community.
Okay, we'll wait just a moment to see if there are any more questions.
Sure.
Do you have plans to feature other women community founders in the Tampa Bay area?
Well, our work at Ruskin Library is centered on Ruskin. My personal work is on South County, anything below. Well, I've done some work in the eastern part of the county and the southern part of the county. I've written several articles in the Osprey Observer. I got a question from WFLA yesterday on women of color and also Latina people in Ruskin and the area. That's piqued my interest a bit, and I promised Jennifer that I would take a hard look into that. So there could be something coming on that, but nothing specific comes to mind right at the moment.
All right. Well, it looks like that may be all the questions we have for tonight. If you want to contact us, you can give us a call or send us a comment via our website. And we also invite you to share with us how the library has made a difference in your life by submitting your library story at hcplc.org/stories. And then to learn about this or other upcoming events that we have going on, both virtual and in person, you can visit hcplc.org/events for our calendar. And as I said at the beginning, this will be posted on our YouTube site once we're able to get that cut down and put up. Thank you once again, Charlie, for this great presentation, and thank you everyone for attending tonight's event.
My pleasure.
Enjoy the rest of your evening.